old pillars and caulked the crevices of their homes, they'd long learnt that he was not called the wind taster for nothing. We may get back to what that might mean, but and I should say that story, which I definitely recommend, and this whole anthology I recommend, but the idea of the tasting the wind and smelling and knowing when the hurricanes are coming, but also how Montos first gained that skill, which goes back to the slave trade and many other aspects that I'm sure we'll touch on today. So, Jeremy, to begin with, maybe just tell us how did Peepal Tree Press come to be, and especially come to be in Leeds?
Well, it came to be in Leeds because I was in Leeds.
Yes.
That was the thing. And I've been in Leeds for probably 55 years or more than that. It began, I mean, there's always a prehistory to everything, but I won't go into the prehistory. I'll give a sort of starting myth, really. Okay. And that took place in Guyana. And it probably took place in about 1984, where I'd been working on a thesis about Indians in the Caribbean. And I had a friend there called Rubla Mona, and he lived in one of the small villages up the coast. His parents had been cane cutters. He'd got a few GCSEs, he'd worked as a bookkeeper, but he was a writer, and that's what he wanted to do. And he supported his writing by doing things like riding around bicycles, selling ice pops, and anything to make a little bit of money. It was at a point where Ghana was going through a really difficult time in the 80s. The IMF had called in all their loans and all that kind of stuff. So there was some real poverty in Ghana. Things that used to be imported could not be imported. So paper wasn't imported. I could still remember sort of on that trip, I think it must have been that trip, of being a bit suspicious when the woman on the plane next to me said, "Would you carry my bag off the plane for me?" And you think, what's going on here? But anyway, it was really heavy. But it turned out what it had in was a huge lump of cheese, which was worth its weight in gold. The problem in there was that Mona could not get his stories published. There was no paper. And, there was a lot of smuggling going on, but nobody was bringing in paper. So he'd given me a lot of kind of hospitality. So my return to him was to do this book. He had this really good little collection of short stories called Back Down People, which was about the Indian cane workers on the sugar estates. And that was the very first Peepal Tree book. It was made at home. It was printed at I was still working as a FE college lecturer, and the technicians did it after hours for me. We papered the paper. And then I seem to remember that we had all these sheets of paper on the carpet at home and knew nothing about how you made books at that time. It was actually printed on an old daisy wheel printer, and you've got to probably be over the age of 50 or 60 to know what a daisy wheel printer is. So that was how the first book, and I remember going to, it must have been a second or third Black Book Fair in London, and having a quarter of a table with this big pile of Back Down Peoples, and being quite amazed that I actually sold them. And that was the beginning. That was in 1985 of the first thing, and then it kind of grew from there. I mean, I'd finished the thesis in 1985, and instead of calling it quits at that point, then the publishing started. Because I'd met, there were quite a lot of people who I knew as a result of doing the research, who'd got good books around. It was also a time where some of the people who'd been involved in publishing Caribbean writing had stopped doing it. People like Heinemann they had a Caribbean Writers series. And it was a period where a lot of publishers were being taken over by bigger publishers. And then obviously accountants got in and thought, this Caribbean writing lark is not making us any money. Let's scrap that series. So there seemed to me a kind of a niche there that could be occupied. Of course, you realise why it was a niche, because nobody else was capable of making any kind of money out of it. And one of the things I remember when I did Back Down People, I wrote this kind of little kind of afterword. It was quite apologetic, really. He was saying things like, this is like taking coals to Newcastle. It was kind of, it was a model of the kind of taking a raw product and making it and sending it back, like cocoa to Ghana or in chocolate to Ghana. And I didn't at that stage kind of really quite understand why literary publishing had never really got off the ground in the Caribbean. And I understand it very well now. So that as the time went on, you began to realize what a crucial kind of role it was in terms of, of giving voice to lots of people who otherwise were not getting a voice.
And that question of why it hasn't taken off in the Caribbean, I'd love to come back to at some point, because I think that it's an intriguing, dangling question there.
Size and market.
Yeah, okay. Jacob, when did you first become aware of Peepal Tree Press? Did they come to you? Did you come to them? How did that relationship form?
It's a really good question. They were always there, Peepal Tree Press. I used to work as an editor in London, and it was quite an important magazine. It was called, I think, Art Rage. And whenever anything major was happening in the black community, and in those days, black meant Asian, it meant anybody who wasn't Caucasian, English, white. And I was aware of them because they sent books for review and stuff. Everybody was, and so I was very much aware of them. But I think it was many years later, many years later, maybe 10, 15 years later, when I moved from London to Leeds because I got a bit fed up with London. I think it's a crazy place. And I went to live in Leicester, and eventually, I don't know how it happened. I think it was like any good relationship. Good people bring you together. They know you're good for each other, so they kind of say, well, And eventually, I ended up joining Peepal Tree Press, and it's a fantastic job. I've been there for quite a few years now. I can't even remember. I think it might be age. But I've been there for almost a decade, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, for quite a while. I'm working, and it's a fantastic working environment, an excellent working relationship. And I have published books with Peepal Tree Press. In fact, my biggest book so far was first published by Peepal Tree, and then it was bought by a bigger publisher, by one of the mainstream publishers. So we've had a very productive and very good relationship there. Yeah, I've been around for a while.
Perhaps just to say, and I would be guilty if I didn't say this bit, which was one of the reasons why we were able to take Jacob on, was that we'd been taken on by the Arts Council as a regularly funded organisation. Part of the history of Peepal Tree is that right going back, this is about probably the early stages, I describe it as an expensive hobby. And this ran totally from home. It became a slightly less expensive hobby, but a much more head-banging kind of hobby when we bought an old printing press off the guy who was printing for us. And we have the printing press in our old garage. So Peepal Tree's always been a very, very kind of do-it-yourself. The Arts Council gave us some funding we applied for it, it was competitive, in I think about 1993 or 4 or something. And this was for kind of a development of trying to get some smaller publishers off the ground to doing more stuff. I mean, the pattern often was that, if you were very small, you might do 1 or 2 books a year, then you'd have to wait till you got some money back, then you might do another 1 or 2 books. So there was never any continuity about it. So we got quite a generous grant at that stage. And I'm going to say Peepal Tree is the only one of the people who got funding then that survived. But it was so that, we were funded for a bit, then they ceased funding us because there was a change in their funding arrangements. And I think round about probably 2011, and that would have been figured where Jacob came on the scene, we were taken on as a regularly funded organisation. So on top of the money, we largely supported ourselves by printing. So for a long time, Peepal Tree Press ran a print business. We printed our own books. We printed lots of books for other people. We did sort of some of the kind of newsletters of some of the Leeds charities and things like that. I remember we used to do the home workers paper and things like that. And this was good stuff. But then when we got some more funding, it came in at a very good time. It came in at a point where the kind of print business was beginning to everybody had websites by that stage. So people were no longer doing quite so many kind of things. And we accumulated enough books by that stage to sort of have this constant kind of problem of did we reprint a book or did we do the new book? And the Arts Council money meant, we were able to kind of start looking at becoming a more conventional publisher by sending our stuff off to be printed by somebody else. And it gave us some money so that we could expand a bit in terms of who was working with Peepal Tree. So Jacob was one of the people who came in at that stage.
Well, that feels particularly pertinent. And for any of you who are involved in the arts or care about the arts, you may have read there's a lot of discussion going on about the role of funding these days and the Arts Council. You are still an NPO, is that right?
Yeah, we're still a
National
an
portfolio,
NPO.
yeah.
And I mean, the situation now is that we could actually, it's taken a long time to get there. We could survive. We'd probably do less books.
Yeah.
We certainly wouldn't be able to employ all the people we employ, but we do a lot of other things other than publish books.
Yes.
We run, we run a national writer development program. We run the program that Jacob's going to tell you about in a minute, the Leeds-based one. We do a lot of things that I suppose are about, not so much about selling books, but about providing information about books. So that, most of the people on the rest of the team is concerned with that kind of, public information about the books we publish.
Mm. Well, before we turn to the theme that we're going to really dig into tonight, which is about the land, climate, ecology, but also human beings in relation to that, Jacob, can you tell us a bit about the Writers and Readers Group? Readers and Writers Group.
Yeah. I don't know if you're aware of it, but Leeds, West Yorkshire, it's becoming a bit of a cultural center. A lot of stuff seem to be moving from London, basically, to here. A couple of weeks ago, I think, we had the Calabash Literary Festival, which, had its root in Jamaica, but it's quite a big international festival. And then we had another one, whose name I don't remember.
Bocas.
Yeah, the Bocas Literary Festival. So something seems to be happening at the moment in I say Leeds, but by Leeds I mean Yorkshire, right? So forgive me if you do think I'm excluding you. And one of the things that we have been experiencing, especially over the past 4 years, is that we started thinking about a developmental program, which would cater especially for the people living in the local areas. And that was about 4 to 5 years ago that we started that. So we started, running workshops with some of the major writers that we publish. I can call a whole range of names here. Some of them some of them you will eventually get to know, but quite established writers from all over the world, the diaspora, be it the Caribbean, North America, whatever. And they're exposed to these writers. Usually these are writers who are coming from minoritized communities. So, and of course, many of these people that we have, for example, I did a quick analysis of the 40 or 50 people that we have on our books. They range from the late teens to 84, in terms of age. Their profiles are really interesting. There are people who, sort of survive on Social Security, a couple of them. And we have a couple of professors also, and they attend the same workshop, attend the same forum. And it does not necessarily mean that a person's background, means that they're less effective or less good as a writer. That's one of the surprising things. Sometimes people who come from, quote-unquote, very humble backgrounds tend to produce absolutely amazing stuff, brilliant stuff. And we're doing that. And one of the things that I think that is central to all of it is at the end of a series of activities of workshop over the year, also, we produce a collection of writing, an anthology of writing. And what's fascinating about that, I'll tell you, for example, about the last one we did, which is called Weighted Words, was that it's there that I discovered, or we discovered, that one of the writers was the first black woman gymnast to represent Britain at the Olympics in 1984 in Los Angeles. She was sitting there in the audience, asking questions, as any person who was attending a workshop would do. And then we started getting their stories from them. We have, again, another woman who lives in Leeds, another writer who lives in Leeds, and who never wrote before. And she was one of the first, again, black females to actually get a scholarship to the Rambert, the classical dance company. That's a very prestigious company. Yeah. And there is another man a young man who lives in Leeds, and he has created a whole dance vocabulary based on what he calls the reggae aesthetic. And these are people who are telling their stories. We have midwives. There's one midwife who spent most of her life in the 1950s and 60s working, and everybody knew her on the street. And she can give you a very good history of how midwifery worked in those times. And of course, in 100 years' time, when people look back on these years, through these writings, they would get a very strong sense of how people lived. So this is no, we thought it was going to be 100 books and just give each person a copy. You can find it on Amazon now. People who review it, it has become a very useful archival document. And one of the things that it has done, certainly for us, is that it's added to the story, that is the story of Leeds, of West Yorkshire, of Britain, basically, so that, you know, if they all disappear and get replaced by somebody else, if we all disappear and get replaced by another population, their voices will be part of that, the voice that says, we were here too. And that, for us, is extremely important. So as a matter of fact, my respect and valuing of this particular project I'm working on at the moment has grown enormously when I began to get a sense of the significance, the weight of it, the heft of it. And it's not to be treated trivially. The other thing I want to say about this is that there are stories, you know, we have this myth about writers as though, you know, one is born with a blue light falling on one, and one is destined or blessed to write. We don't know that. What many of these people who see themselves as writers and actually are right, is a belief in themselves. Politicians, for example, take it for granted that at the end of their term, they will write a book. Who gave them that confidence? What happens if you have people coming from very quote-unquote ordinary backgrounds and you give them or you allow them that confidence? What can they produce? And some of them have extraordinary stories to tell. I just told you two. I have many, many more that you have in that book there. People who ordinary, like us, like the rest of us, but what they have lived through, what they have experienced, the inner life is exceptional, you know? And that's why this Readers and Writers program is so important. Not just to people at Tree Press, but I think to those of us who live in this part of the world and beyond.
Well, it's first thrilling to hear you talk about 100 years' time and how this will matter, and the idea of archives, which is close to our hearts here, but also the idea of the so-called quote-unquote ordinary people, uncelebrated people, and the potential to become writers. And that facet of what Peepal Tree Press does is something that really sets you apart. Jeremy, do you want to read some either poetry or some writing?
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
to turn to, you know, the invitation to talk about the theme of home and how that relates to issues like climate change. And I made the point we were talking before, was that if in the UK we tend to think of climate change as something that's really just happening and something we have to deal with now, it's in the future. I think the point I'd want to make about the Caribbean is that the effects of what we're learning to call the Anthropocene, the ways in which man-made shaping of the environment is changing the world we live in, began 400 years ago. It began when Europeans saw the possibilities of making their fortunes there. It began with the destruction of what was largely a forested landscape to make way for sugar monoculture and all the things that followed on from that. It involved ethnic cleansing, the disappearance of the Amerindians and Caribs, who were the inhabitants there. It obviously involved the importation under conditions of enforced slavery of people from Africa and then later from India and China. And it's a region where people are still living with the consequences of those kind of things, and we'll say a little bit more about that. So that there are things that go back 400 years, particularly in things in terms of like the way soil has eroded, the way the possibilities of actually growing things is under constant threat. But then it's also like many island societies at the very kind of sharp end of global warming, sea rising, and so on. And we'll say a little bit about that. But I'd like to begin just by reading one of the poems, a poem by a chap called Jeffrey Philp, who's a Jamaican who lives in Miami, as a lot of Jamaicans do, who has a collection called Archipelagos, which is a collection of where he's looking at the kind of connections between kind of the ecological issues, but also putting them in that kind of historical kind of context of now and then back then. This is the title poem. Perhaps just to explain, there are 2 or 3 things in it where I hope I don't insult anybody by making explanations. He mentions somebody called Orbach. And Orbach is a reference to a writer called Rachel Orbach, a Jewish writer who wrote a book, and he quotes from this book. He mentions the word Leviathan, and he wants us to get it both in the terms of the biblical term, that Leviathan, another name for the whale, but also the kind of Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is a kind of model of the kind of powerful state. He mentions Sam Sharp. Sam Sharp was a Baptist leader who led a slave rebellion right at the end of slavery. And he mentions the Maroons. The Maroons were the groups of people who managed to escape from the plantations. And in Jamaica, where there was hilly landscape, fought the British to a standstill, to the extent to which there was a treaty where they agreed to leave each other alone. So this is Jeffrey Philp's poem. At the end of this sentence, a flood will rise and swallow low-lying islands of the Caribbean, like when Hurricane Maria whipped the Atlantic into the ring of thunderstorms that advanced in the way Orbach described her vision of terror. Wooden huts torn away from their foundations were carried away. Women and children were tied to the ceiling beams, but no one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof, like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately toward heaven, towards the riverbanks for help. And a man, chest deep in the surge that snatched his family from his arms, in the seas swelling before him, like Columbus and his crew imagined Leviathan, whose mere sight is overpowering, who look down on all that is haughty. But wasn't it pride, greed, those sins we've forgotten, for they remind us of what we could have become instead of what we've settled for, that extended our reach like the virus with its crown of spikes around the waste of the world to the polar ice caps, melting into the ocean that's rising 1 inch every 3 years in Miami, where leatherbacks lumber out of the water to lay their eggs as carefully as I swaddle my grandniece in a blanket. Scenes my daughter remembers in the same breath with the bumper sticker on the first car I owned. Save the whales. The protests where we marched before she could walk. The war she inherited, the Vietnam War, along with my grandmother's hair. That simple country girl from St. James, home to Sam Sharp and the Maroons, who fought redcoats, whose bayonets were stained with the blood of Africans kidnapped from huts under the growl of the Harmattan sweep over the Sahara, to the rim of the Cape Verde Islands, garlanded by trade winds that complete the circle and begin a new alphabet of catastrophe. Hurricanes that stagger like a betrayed lover, barreling through the islands, until its rage is spent on the sands of our beaches, littered with masks and plastic bottles.
And Jacob, that I could almost imagine that poem being in dialogue with your story that we began with in some ways.
Yeah.
Is there something that particularly grabs your ear as far as being a way that literature from the Caribbean perhaps sheds a light on some of these things?
Yes, of course. One of the great sort of symbols, if you like, that we use, that many poets and writers from the Caribbean use, is the image of the hurricane, huracan, which is an Amerindian word that points to disaster, that points to, and of course the story from which you kind of read an extract is about a hurricane. It's about heritage too. It's about history, and this points very strongly at history. This poem, and this is a story that imagines. I don't know. Has anybody here ever heard of the Zong? It's a very famous story where a guy called, I think it was Cunningham, the captain of a ship. These businessmen connected with the Bank of England invested in a shipload of African slaves, because that's what they did, to take them over to the Caribbean, and when they get sold, they would make a handsome profit. But the captain of this ship, perhaps he looked at the 3,000-mile crossing and imagined the storms and the kinds of dangers that they would have faced in those days in crossing the ocean. So what did he decide to do? He decided to dump all the women and children overboard, this Englishman, and return to claim the insurance. And that got a lot of, people in this country. It awoke a lot of people here to the kind of immediate cruelties of the slave trade. So this story is about, it's premised on a question: what happens if one of the people who was thrown overboard was a girl who didn't die or didn't perish, but travels the ocean, underneath the waves, and emerges in the place where she was intended to be taken in the Caribbean 400 years later? How would we as Caribbean people, having lived these 400 years, how would we welcome this African, this native African? How would we deal with her? How would we greet her? And of course, it's a dialogue with history, and in a way, it's a poem that resonates very strongly with a very powerful preoccupation of Caribbean writers, because history is not in the past, as some of these MPs tend to want to make you think. History is now. History is a living thing, and when you get told to forget about these incidents in history, I ask, well, why don't you forget about the Magna Carta, which you still live by? Or if my history is irrelevant, then Shakespeare is also. So you get what I'm saying? And our engagement, we are what we are today. You are what you are today. You are a product of your history too. And that's why writers like the one whose work Jeremy is reading now, like my work, if they're serious about their place in the world, would engage with history, because you can't run from it.
Let me read another poem. I was good because it fits in exactly. This is another one by Geoffrey Philp from the collection that's forthcoming next year. And it's called Olakun's Justice. And Olakun is a female deity, a god from the Yoruba religion. She's a water deity, I suppose a female version of Neptune or Poseidon, a sea god. And it's called Olakun's Justice. The first insult was the bodies of warriors huddled in the hold of slavers like the Zong, and the captain, low on fresh water, led elders to the stern and prodded them with swords until they plunged feet first into the froth that held their arms afloat for a moment, and then swallowed them into the blue, their bones strewn over the Atlantic, which every June, when the harmattan gathers clouds over the seabed, lashes coconut fronds until skies turn as dark as Eshu's eyes scanning barrier islands, pelts tourists helpless as starfish stranded on dunes with hail, the lies of fathers visited upon their children, her anger spilling over the seawall down Las Olas, where sharks and small fish navigate the shuttered storefronts. And so Eshu is another Yoruba Orisha who's about balance and fairness, or one of his functions is. And her anger is Olakun's anger about what's happened. So this is things. So the reference to Las Olas is actually in flooding in Fort Lauderdale, where there might well have been sharks and small fish navigating. So this is the return, so that that somewhere like Miami is beginning to taste a taste of its own kind of medicine. So that's one. But I think one of the perhaps one of the points to be made here is the kind of the issue. I mean, there was when I was thinking about this, there were several things that kind of, you know, sort of. I mean, there are lots of ways you could deal with it, think about it. One of the ways about it was thinking about the issue of waste, and clearly that poem is in that sense is about waste, and about the disposal of people. In the other poem, it's about the plastic waste which is turning up on the shores. It's about overconsumption. It's about constant production. The global capitalism wanting ever greater markets, and this is something that I think, you know, there's a short extract from a novel written quite a long time ago, 1964, by a chap called Orlando Patterson, and the novel's called The Children of Sisyphus. And you know the myth of Sisyphus, who's pushing a ball up the hill, and then it rolls down, and he has to keep. So there's a constant kind of struggle. And what he writes about, he writes specifically about the fact that in Kingston at that time, there were large numbers of people living on a rubbish dump. It was known as a dungle, sort of Jamaican kind of thing for the jungle and the dump merged together. And he sees that as a kind of, I mean, it's a reality. So but it's also kind of a metaphor for the way, in a sense, that people had been brought to the Caribbean and then just left there. And, you know, one of the things that I think, you know, we perhaps talk about in terms of the response, because perhaps the thing that has most characterized Caribbean experience is the necessity of migration. Right from the points where, during the period of slavery, I mean, we've seen one kind of particularly vile method of people balancing their books. But some of the studies of kinds of like mortality in Jamaica in the 18th and 17th and 18th centuries was the idea that the population turned over every 7 years. People's lives were so short. And then gradually, at the end of slavery, it took a long time for populations to start to rise. I mean, even during the period between the ending of the slave trade and the end of slavery itself, the theory was, because there was no more slave trade, that the plantation owners would treat their enslaved people better. But they clearly didn't, because the population declined. But once slavery had ended and people had more means for doing things for themselves, populations gradually rose, with the consequence that in many parts of the Caribbean, it soon reached the point where populations were in excess of any kind of work that could be created. The sugar industry declined. I mean, with the point where beet sugar began to take over, there was a slow decline of the sugar industry. But very often in ways that didn't give kind of like the peasant farmers access to good land. So they were often farming on the hillsides and off the most fertile kind of land. But right from probably the 1850s, 1860s, the necessity of migration became about the dominant part of Caribbean life. So that it begins with the kind of movement of people from the countryside into the towns, where there often wasn't any work. It begins with the kind of movement of people from one island to another. So somewhere like Trinidad, which was perhaps slightly more industrialized than other places, drew in people from lots of the other small islands. So I think at the minute, something like perhaps almost 1 in 3 Trinidadians came from somewhere else. It involved people desperately looking for work in things like the Panama Canal. So large numbers of men went off and worked in the Panama Canal and died in huge quantities. It began in the sort of 1920s with people going to America and Canada, and small numbers here, and then much larger numbers here. So the fact is that without migration, the Caribbean just would not survive. I mean, with sort of rising healthcare standards, and the fact that because of the kind of but things always kind of coincide. because of the kind of that history of what sugar did to the soil and exhausted soils. I mean, for I think like about 100 years, the Caribbean was so fertile because nobody grown anything there much before, except in small kinds of very kind of ecologically sound ways, the Amerindians. For a long time, people grew sugar without bothering with any kind of fertilizers at all, which just rapidly exhausted the soil. And as you know, it takes about 100 years to grow it, to get an inch of topsoil. So all this was blasted away. And then that coincides with what is happening now in terms of, I mean, we mentioned hurricanes. I mean, there have always been hurricanes in the Caribbean. But what people in the Caribbean are noticing now is that they come round with alarming frequency because the sea is getting warmer, the hurricanes become more violent and more frequent. And what hurricanes and those kinds of tropical rains do is they wash soil away. So lots of good topsoil ends up in the sea. So, you know, there are all those things sort of begin to come together as a kind of issues of great difficulty. I mean, I read somewhere that something like 14% of kind of ruined lands you can't really do anything with, in the world is in the Caribbean. And that's an extraordinarily kind of high percentage of anything there. I mean, some of it, I mean, it's interesting. Some of it is kind of, was about the myths that I think Europeans had about the Caribbean. They thought they'd arrived in another Eden because things grew so easily. I don't know if you, I suddenly remembered there's an Andrew Marvell poem, you know, the poet who came from Hull, who wrote this poem called The Bermudas. And he has these lines. And it's kind of a song of praise to God for allowing the kind of, you know, these are religious refugees who are you know, Protestants who are fleeing, or not Protestants, they're dissenters. So he gave us this eternal spring which here enambles everything and sends the fowl to us in care on daily visits through the air. He hangs in shades the orange bright like golden lamps in a green night, and does in the pomegranate's close jewels more rich than Ormuz shows. He makes the figs our mouths to meet and throws the melons at our feet. This is an Eden where you don't have to do anything. It's all there. But of course, you know, the reality was there were a lot of people there and you know, the kind of ways in which sugar in the end became cultivated was masses of mounts had to be dug into the soil. And of course, this was done by enslaved Africans. So, the idea of waste is a powerful thing. You know, in terms of people looking at the whole themes of kind of an out of control global capitalism, waste as well as global warming is one of the critical themes. And just read just a little bit from Orlando Patterson's book. I say it's from the point of view of three rubbish collectors who are on their donkey carts taking, you know, rubbish from the city onto the dung heap, where people, you know, where there are quite large numbers of people living. On the left of the road would be the miserable little huts of Backer Wall, slutty and grimy, with tiny little peepholes beneath the old zinc ceilings. Through them, half-naked children too hungry to play and shriveled, atrophic old men with their black gums too weak to move would be peering. And there would be the younger ones, seedy and slow, with long hands and drooping shoulders lounging on the sidewalk, glaring up at them from beneath their foreheads, with the whitish yellow of their eyes, all waiting for the night to fall. So they continue on this way. And one of the Sammy the garbage man in the middle turned and went in the opposite direction of the place where they dumped the disinfected food. So in order to prevent the poorest people from actually using the food that was waste, the city kind of things pour disinfectant on it, but that doesn't stop the people eating it. Eventually, he reached the part of the dungle that was not inhabited. The gathering herd had grown into a mob behind him. It was a wide open field of debris which undulated from the driveway to the nearby sea. He drove the cart up the little patch that led from the road, stopped about a chain in, and pulled off the canvas that covered the debris in the cart. As he threw off the canvas, a swarm of flies flew up in the air and then came back down upon the debris again. Immediately they swarmed in upon him. He dug his shovel into the muck and flung it out, unmindful of which of them it fell on. It was a free-for-all, a mad, raging, screaming, laughing, angry, hungry scramble, a wolf pack at war. Men and women and children and beasts all joined in snatching and grabbing and biting one another for any new prize they found in the garbage, and so on. And you could make the point that, you know, this is a kind of a minority of kind of the very poorest of Jamaicans. But you see that, you know, it's prophetic. I mean, if you look at any of the kind of stories about, you know, what happens in India, what happens in Africa,
India.
then, you know, the kind of the large numbers of people who live off dung heaps is one of the kind of features. And we actually export rubbish to places. So I think there's a prophetic kind of thing about rubbish as one of the kind of consequences of sort of global production.
And again, that was Orlando Patterson writing in the mid-'60s.
He's writing in the 60s, yeah.
We are astonishingly almost at the end of our 50 minutes of conversation, which just makes me think that there needs to be more, because we've only scratched the surface, and I know that you have other passages that we could be reading, and maybe there's a part two even before the next Writing on Air festival, so that we can continue to dive deeper into this story. But I just, in a kind of closing, I think, Elliot, is that right, Peter, that we've got about 5 minutes or so before we're ready to switch off? So we were going to open it up to the audience here in the radio theater at East Leeds FM, but I think what we can do is, as we move downstairs, Jeremy and Jacob will be here, and the conversations can continue before we come up for Senny's show, or after Senny's show as well, if you're still around. But I guess in closing thoughts, Jacob, wanted to put one question to you quickly, and just particularly hearing this last passage, Orlando Patterson writing in the mid-'60s. When you were growing up and first discovering literature, did you find Caribbean writers, were they out there? Were you connecting with them, or was it difficult to find? And was Patterson or Derek Walcott, other writers on your radar?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was very fortunate. I was the first of my generation coming from basically an agricultural background to have access to secondary education. And that was because of the changing of our law. And that's where I began to be introduced by teachers coming from a lot of teachers come from abroad to our own literature, to Caribbean literature. I didn't know it existed until then. And I discovered people like Derek Walcott and writers like that. And they were like aliens. Yeah, because in the sense that we had absolutely no access to them, because most of them in the 1950s and 60s were here in England. In order to become a writer in the Caribbean, to a large extent still, you can't live in the Caribbean. There are a couple of writers who have done it, like Earl Lovelace and a few others, but these writers have other professions. But it's impossible, still is, to sustain oneself on writing. It's not very difficult to do it here in England. You can teach as a writer and also. So I became aware of it quite late. On the other hand, I was very familiar with English literature because of the school system. And in a way, the extract that Jeremy was reading a while ago, that could have been Dickens writing that. Because I mean, this clearly is a kind of protest, isn't it? It's a protest about the conditions, and that's what Charles Dickens was doing. Exactly when he was, writing about the Industrial Revolution and its impact on children and on human lives. The political reflex, if you like, is not at all different from Charles Dickens's. Although I have some problems with Dickens too, but at the end of the day, I think that, and it's really interesting to see how these two contrasting realities, geographical realities, the Caribbean and in Britain, how sometimes they mirror each other. Because this country has a very, very strong and rich and deep history of protest, but nobody wants you to know about it. It's true, they're terrified of it. Nobody wants you to know how powerful and strong British women, oh my God, they like Caribbean women. They're fighters, they're warriors. They don't want you to know about it. That's all I have to say.
Well, just as a very brief, are we going to jump in, Peter? Just as a very brief, and this is just to close it all up, bringing you back to the notion of home and Peepal Tree Press. If Peepal Tree Press was a home, what kind of home, Jeremy? How would you, if you had to just in a sentence or so, what kind of home would you want people to think of it as being, both the writers and the readers that meet there? And then Jacob, how would you describe it as a home too, whether it's an image or sensory?
I think I'd just want to sort of close what I have to say about, I mean, clearly from what we've been saying so far, that the notion of home is an ambivalent one. Mm. You know, so many people have had to leave and that thing. But I wouldn't want to go without saying that in the midst of all those kinds of things, and of the consequences of history and things, that the Caribbean has been, you know, it remains an absolutely remarkable place in terms of having fought against all those things, but in terms of its creativity. You know, when you just think about its Caribbean's creativity in music, in sporting achievement, in literary and artistic production. Look at the number of Nobel writers come from the Caribbean. In intellectual excellence, the C.L.R. Jameses and so on and so on and so on. It has, you know, it has a world status out of all proportion to its actual size, which is really wholly remarkable. And it's also recognizing that there remain deep attachments. You know, although people have that ambivalence about how difficult it often is to live in. I mean, for some people it isn't. Some people, the Caribbean is a very pleasant place to be. But they tend to be the richer people who live up on the hills. Mm. But there remains a deep kind of attachment, you know, including from people who've long left the Caribbean behind. It remains hugely inside them. Yeah,
it's visceral. It took me a long time to kind of acknowledge to myself what I am, because my children have been born here, they grew up here. I came to this country for 5 years, and it's 35 plus now, going on for it. And the only thing I've managed to preserve is my accent, probably. But when I go to the Caribbean, that's it. When I go to the Caribbean now, go back to my home island, which is Grenada, lots of the kids, my tiny little nieces or whatever, they would ask me, they would say, where you come from? Because what they're hearing is the English, the diphthong in my voice, which I've picked up over the years. And of course, when I come back here, and as soon as I get into Heathrow, wherever it is, you know, they want to know if I've got any relatives or anybody here, because I sound so bloody foreign. So in a way, I'm what you call a straddler. I have one foot across the Atlantic and one here. Because when I'm there for 5 or 6 weeks at a time, I get anxious. I want to get back here. You know, I've got work to do. I've got people. I've got friends. I've got my boss. you know what I mean. And here is where my brain is engaged, because it's a rich, it's highly stimulating activity. You know, or area of activity. So I'm one of those hybrids. I'm one of those straddlers. 1 foot across there and one here. When I go back, I just do. In fact, they're shocked when I return. Take off my long trousers and stuff. Put on a pair of sandals, you know, and I get a mango. And I have a daughter there. She will die before she sees her father walking, eating a mango, because I was in England, you know, and I bring back all my bad habits that I picked up there, you know, and so on. So it's a mixed-up thing. Home is where the love is. Some people say home is where the heart is. I say home is where the love is. And there's a lot of love here and a lot of love there.
Well, thank you. Jacob Ross and Jeremy Poynting from Peepal Tree Press. Over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, Tony, Jeremy, and Jacob. It's been a fascinating conversation. We're going to follow on in 10 minutes' time. We're going to start Unknown Soldier. So don't go too far, but have a stroll around, have another energy ball if there are any left. I don't know if there are. So thank you again. See you in 10 minutes' time. Bye-bye.
From Seacroft, East Leeds, Yorkshire, Europe, the world, the universe, the multiverse.